Picture a quiet summer afternoon in a sunlit garden. On a small wooden table by an open window sat a jar of golden honey, its lid left off. The warm air was heavy with the fragrance of sweetness. A lone honeybee appeared, drawn irresistibly by that smell. It circled in the air, then landed on the sticky rim of the jar to investigate. At first, the bee moved delicately, dipping its tiny mouthparts to sip the syrup, but the sheer abundance of honey seemed to overwhelm its caution. The bee ventured further in, seeking more of the rich sweetness. Suddenly, one of its legs slipped on the slick edge. In an instant, the little creature plunged into the thick honey. Its translucent wings beat frantically, but each struggle only coated them in more sticky gold. The bee writhed, a dark speck trapped in an amber pool. Within moments, the movement slowed. The bee, so small and so fervent in its desire, was overcome. It drowned in the very sweetness it sought. Nearby, a man stood watching, transfixed. The late afternoon light poured through the window, and everything around him was quiet and still. The only sound was his own breath as he witnessed the tiny life succumb. It was a strange and sorrowful sight, tragic yet oddly illuminating. To him, it felt like a parable of nature, though he had not yet put it into words. In that silent moment, something in him shifted, as though a curtain had been drawn back to reveal a hidden truth. Later, he would recall this scene in the concise words of the Greek writer Nikos Kazantzakis. "Once I saw a bee drown in honey and I understood." Now that the scene is vivid in our minds, let's turn to the text itself and unpack what it might mean. The line, "Once I saw a bee drown in honey and I understood," was written by Nikos Kazantzakis, a prominent 20th century Greek author and philosopher. Kazantzakis is best known for novels like Zorbata Greek and The Last Temptation of Christ, as well as for his spiritual memoir Report to Greco, where this bee anecdote appears. Throughout his work, he grappled with the tension between earthly desires and higher spiritual aspirations. This single sentence about the bee is terse, but it's embedded with layers of significance that resonate with that lifelong preoccupation. Let's examine the sentence piece by piece, almost under a microscope. It begins with "once," signaling that what follows is a specific experience, one significant moment in time. This wasn't a recurring event or a hearsay story. It was a first-hand encounter that left a deep impression. Next, "I saw a bee drown in honey" presents us with a plain observation delivered in simple language. Yet the content of that observation is anything but ordinary. We have a tiny bee in a mass of honey, an image of a creature perishing by way of the very thing it naturally desires most. Honey for a bee is pure delight, nourishment, the goal of all its work. To say it drowned in honey is to paint a paradox. The symbol of sweetness and reward becomes the agent of destruction. Immediately, the quote conjures the themes of desire and excess. Desire here means a strong longing or appetite for something one finds pleasurable or valuable. In this case, the bee's attraction to the sweet nectar. Excess means an amount or intensity that is too much, more than the balanced or beneficial limit. The bee encountered honey in such excess that what should have been bliss became lethal. Without any further explanation, Kazantzakis' words sketch a cautionary tale. Even the most delightful fulfillment, if uncontrolled, can become a trap. Finally, we come to the simple conclusion of the sentence. "And I understood." This is where the enigma lies. Understood what exactly? Kazantzakis doesn't spell it out. He doesn't follow up with a moral like, "and I understood that moderation is necessary," or "and I understood the danger of too much pleasure." He leaves it open-ended. This openness invites us into the experience. We as listeners or readers are prompted to complete the thought ourselves. The phrasing suggests that the understanding was immediate and intuitive. It wasn't a long analytic reasoning, it was an insight that flashed in that moment. Perhaps it was a kind of noetic understanding, noetic meaning a direct inner knowing that goes beyond words. We get the sense that by watching that tiny drama, Kazantzakis grasped a truth about life in a flash of insight. Now, what might that truth be? Given the context of his work, it likely has to do with the peril of unbridled craving, or the irony that the pursuit of pleasure can lead to suffering. The bee and honey image almost blatantly points to that. Perhaps Kazantzakis, seeing the bee's fate, recognized a reflection of the human condition, how we too can be overwhelmed by the very things we pursue for happiness. Maybe in that instant he saw some of his own desires in the bee's doomed quest, and it struck him as a profound lesson. But it's important to emphasize, the text itself doesn't enumerate these lessons. Kazantzakis exercises philosophical restraint here. He trusts the image to convey meaning without an explicit sermon attached. The word understood stands as a placeholder for whatever realization blossomed in him at that time. In context, this line sits within Report to Greco, a book where Nikos dialogues with his spiritual influences and recounts episodes from his life that shaped his worldview. It's a serious reflective work, so when he says he understood, it implies a significant personal revelation. He was a thinker deeply influenced by Greek philosophy, Christianity, Buddhism, and other traditions, all of which have cautioned against the dangers of excess desire. Knowing this, the line takes on the quality of an epiphany in which many of his intellectual learnings crystallized into a single concrete example. The drowning bee became a metaphor for a universal predicament. Overall, our close reading shows the care in Kazantzakis' formulation. He presents a concrete scenario, rich with implications, and then a personal cognitive response to it. The economy of the statement is remarkable. It encompasses the allure of desire, the tragedy of excess, and the spark of understanding. We've identified these themes, desire, excess, and understanding, and noted how the author deliberately leaves understood without an object, making the insight feel vast and inviting interpretation. With this foundation, we can now move from explicating Kazantzakis' words to exploring their larger symbolic and philosophical resonances. Having examined the quote's literal content, we can now step back and consider the bee, the honey, and the act of drowning in symbolic terms. What might each element represent beyond a bee and a jar of honey? Caution is needed here. Kazantzakis himself gives no explicit allegorical key for this scene. He offers us the image and his personal reaction, not a mythological analysis. The interpretations we draw now are our own extrapolations. They can enrich our understanding, but we should keep in mind which ideas are the texts and which are our creative readings. With that said, the triad of bee, honey, and drowning has a timeless archetypal feel. The bee in this scene can stand in for any one of us, or more abstractly, for the human soul or the ego-driven self. It represents a being driven by desire, a creature on a quest for something sweet. Honey, in turn, symbolizes whatever it is that we crave. It could be literal sweetness, like pleasures of food and drink, or figurative sweetness, such as wealth, comfort, sexual pleasure, fame, power, or even knowledge, anything that can entice and delight us. Honey is golden and precious. Many mythologies associate honey with richness and even the divine. Drowning finally symbolizes being overwhelmed, consumed, or destroyed by that which you sought. It is a loss of control, a point of no return. To drown in honey is to suffer a fate both grim and ironic. It means meeting your end by over-immersion in what you loved. This basic symbolic reading, a self drawn to a delight, overindulging and perishing as a result, resonates with countless tales from human culture. For instance, consider the Greek myth of Icarus. In his excitement and hubris, Icarus flies too close to the sun, intoxicated by the thrill of height, only to have the wax of his handmade wings melt, sending him plummeting to his death. The sun in that myth could be seen as Icarus's honey, a source of light and inspiration that becomes lethal when he approaches without restraint. Or recall the story of King Midas, who wished that everything he touched would turn to gold. Midas got his wish, his world turned to gold, but soon found he could not eat, and even his beloved daughter was transformed into a golden statue. His greedy desire backfired horribly. The treasure he craved became a source of sorrow. These stories, like the drowning bee, illustrate the age-old principle that too much of a good thing is a bad thing. In fact, the ancient Greeks had an inscription at the temple of Apollo in Delphi, Madenagan, meaning nothing in excess. We can also bring in two key concepts from Greek thought, sophrosyney and hubris. Sophrosyney is the ideal of wise moderation, self-control, and balance. A person with sophrosyney knows the measure of things, how much is enough, and exercises restraint accordingly. Hubris, the opposite. It's excessive pride or wanton overstepping of boundaries, a kind of arrogant greed for more than one's share. In Greek tragedies and myths, a character's hubris often leads to nemesis divine retribution or downfall. Now, in the image of the bee drowning in honey, we see a living creature that lacked a sense of measure. The bee's hubris, if we anthropomorphize it, was an inability to stop indulging. Of course, a real bee is not morally arrogant, it's just acting on instinct. But symbolically, we can say the bee succumbed to a kind of hubris of appetite. It went beyond the natural limit and paid the price. The scene thus illustrates in miniature what the Greeks would call a violation of sophrosyney. It's a tiny tragedy that echoes the pattern of a great many human tragedies. Beyond Greek lore, the motif of being destroyed by one's desires appears globally. In fairy tales, we have cautionary figures like the gluttonous child who won't stop eating sweets and falls ill, or the fisherman's wife in the Grimm story who keeps wishing for more until she loses everything. In a more philosophical vein, we might think of the image of a moth flying into a flame drawn to the light, even though the light will burn it up. The bee and honey are a similar archetype, the fatal attraction. It embodies a fundamental tension. The things that attract us and give us joy can also undo us if we cannot moderate our pursuit of them. It's important to remember that while these symbolic parallels are compelling, they are extrapolations. Kazantzakis himself does not mention Icarus or Midas or a moth. He doesn't use the terms sophrosyney or hubris in the passage. Those connections are ones we as interpreters are drawing to shed light on the quote's significance. In doing so, we should distinguish between what the text directly shows and what we are reading into it. The text directly shows a bee in honey and an observer's realization. What we read into it is a universal pattern, craving leading to overindulgence and overindulgence leading to ruin. That pattern is well attested in many myths and teachings, which is why the bee image resonates so strongly. So on an archetypal level, the drowning bee is like a mirror held up to the human experience. The mirror shows the interplay of desire and danger. We see ourselves as the bee whenever we chase something wholeheartedly without heed for limits. The honey stands for the world of allure around us, the infinite buffet of pleasures and pursuits life offers. And the drowning is the point at which freedom is lost, when one is engulfed, perhaps even to the point of self-destruction. This symbolic understanding sets the stage for examining how different wisdom traditions understand that scenario. After all, long before Kazantzakis, sages and storytellers across cultures grappled with the very question this image poses. How do we find the right relationship to life's honey so that we can savor it without drowning in it? Buddhist teachings provide a natural starting point for this cross-cultural exploration of desire and excess. At the heart of Buddhism are the Four Noble Truths, the first of which states that life as ordinarily lived is marked by suffering or unsatisfactoriness, dukkha. And the second, that the cause of this suffering is craving, tunha, literally thirst, meaning insatiable desire. A classic Buddhist image is that craving is like a fire that always needs more fuel, never saying enough. One can easily see the parallel. The bee's frantic plunging into the honey is like a being caught in the fire of tunha, unable to stop even though it leads to harm. The Buddha himself, according to tradition, was sheltered in luxury as a prince and then swung to the opposite extreme of severe asceticism, nearly starving himself before discovering the middle way. The middle way is the path of balance, avoiding both indulgence and extreme denial. It teaches that neither drowning in pleasures nor rejecting them entirely will lead to liberation, but rather a mindful engagement without attachment. The ultimate goal in Buddhism, nirvana, literally meaning blowing out, as in extinguishing the flame of craving, is to end the cycle of suffering by letting go of these grasping desires. A Buddhist might look at Kazantzakis' bee and nod in recognition. Yes, uncontrolled desire leads to suffering. The prescription would be to cultivate awareness and compassion to the point where one no longer gets stuck in the honey of sensory pleasure, or at least one learns to taste the honey without clinging to it. Taoism, an ancient Chinese tradition, offers a complementary perspective through the principle of Wu-Wei, which means non-action or effortless action. This concept doesn't imply literal inaction, but rather acting in accordance with nature's flow, without forcing or overdoing. A Taoist sage would likely see the bee's fate as a consequence of going against the natural balance. The Tao Te Ching, attributed to Lao Tzu, is full of warnings about excess. It says things like, "Fill your bowl to the brim and it will spill," and "He who knows that enough is enough will always have enough." In essence, do not overfill, do not overreach. The world operates in cycles and balances. When something is overfull, it naturally diminishes. If you grasp at the highest volume of sweetness, you invite decay or pain. In our metaphor, the bee overfilled itself and perished. The remedy in Taoism would be simplicity and contentment. The ideal is to be like water, adaptable, humble, taking the low places, not clinging to high honeyed heights. Wu-Wei applied to the situation might mean the bee would take just what honey it needs and then move on, never losing harmony by getting stuck. We humans, from a Taoist lens, should not obsessively chase the sweetest highs. Instead, we should appreciate modest pleasures in proportion, remaining free and unattached. That way we align with the Tao, the way things are, and avoid the natural correction that follows extremes. As one of Lao Tzu's verses suggests, even honey can be loathsome in excess, a sentiment that fits our bee story perfectly. Now let's turn to a mystical tradition from the Middle East. Sufism, the contemplative heart of Islam. Sufis speak often of love and longing in almost painful terms. They use rich metaphors, the moth that cannot resist the flame, or the sugar dissolving in tea. One of the central concepts in Sufism is fana, meaning annihilation, specifically the annihilation of the self in the love and knowledge of God, often described as truth with a capital T. At first glance, this sounds like the ultimate drowning, a complete giving up of one's individual existence. Indeed, Sufi poetry is replete with images of drowning in an ocean of divine love or being consumed by divine fire. But crucially for Sufis, this loss of self is not a catastrophe, it is the door to a higher life. When the ego dies in God through fana, what remains is a unity with the divine, which they describe as blissful and liberating. How does this relate to our honeyed bee? It provides an interesting foil. The bee drowned in a material sweetness and died a literal death. A Sufi might say, the problem wasn't the act of drowning per se, but what the bee drowned in. If one drowns in ephemeral pleasure, one simply perishes and gains nothing. But if one drowns, or rather lets the ego dissolve in the infinite sweetness of God's presence, one actually transcends the ordinary life and finds eternal life. In practice, Sufis are actually quite wary of worldly pleasures. Many underwent ascetic practices not unlike Buddhist monks or Christian hermits. The reason is they sought to purify the heart from distractions so that the overwhelming love for God becomes the primary honey they seek. So while the language of drowning in sweetness appears in Sufism, it's very much about transforming desire rather than eliminating it. Turning the desire toward the ultimate so that losing yourself is a victory, not a defeat. Even so, the underlying agreement with other traditions is there. Being enslaved by lower desires, physical or egoistic pleasures, is dangerous. The Sufi just chooses a unique solution. Indulge in the highest desire of all until the petty self is gone. Meanwhile, in the Western philosophical tradition, schools like Stoicism have long taught the importance of mastering one's desires. A Stoic philosopher would likely interpret the bee's demise as a failure of reason to check impulse. Stoicism, which flourished in ancient Greece and Rome, holds that virtue, especially wisdom and self-control, is the key to a good life, and that we should be free from the tyranny of excessive passions. They did not oppose pleasure outright, but they placed it low on the priority list, observing how easily pleasure can captivate and derail us. The Stoics championed the virtue of temperance, essentially the practice of moderation and self-restraint. Consider the words of Epictetus, who advised, "Whenever you are tempted by pleasure, beware lest it carries you away." Or Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, who reminded himself that indulgences often mask their true effects, which can be harmful. To the Stoics, the bee would illustrate exactly what not to do. It surrendered its faculty of choice to the allure of honey. In Stoic terms, it became a slave to an external thing, honey, and in doing so lost the most precious thing, its life. For humans, that also means our rational dignity and freedom. Early Christian thinkers echoed these ideas in a religious key. They identified gluttony and greed as deadly sins, moral honey traps that could lead a soul away from salvation. Christian monastic traditions developed disciplines of fasting and simplicity with the explicit goal of avoiding the kind of outcome our bee faced. Even scripture gives very concrete advice. Have you found honey? Eat only as much as you need, the book of Proverbs warns, lest you be filled with it and vomit. The vividness of that image matches Kazantzakis' in its physicality, and it delivers the same message across millennia and cultural contexts. Don't overdo even the good and sweet things, or suffering will follow. What's remarkable is that across these diverse traditions, Buddhist, Taoist, Sufi, Stoic, Christian, and more, there emerges a common thread of wisdom. All acknowledge the powerful allure of desire, and all warn in their own way that when desire runs rampant, it leads to some form of suffering, bondage, or loss. Yet each tradition also offers a path beyond mere abstinence, a way to channel, understand, or transcend desire. They range from the Buddhist strategy of eradicating craving to end the cycle of rebirth, to the Taoist strategy of harmonizing with nature's flow, to the Sufi strategy of shifting the object of desire to the divine, to the Stoic and similar Christian strategy of using reason and virtue, or grace, to govern and moderate the appetites. These are different flavors of wisdom. One might say they are different flowers from which human culture has extracted nectar. But the honey of insight they produce is strikingly consistent on this point. If we do not find balance, if we do not practice some form of self-awareness and self-restraint, we risk drowning in the very sweetness life offers. And conversely, True freedom or fulfillment may require a kind of rising above the raw pull of craving, whether by gentle non-attachment, by flowing with a higher order, or by letting the self dissolve into something greater. This cross-traditional dialogue doesn't just reinforce the message of the bee and honey metaphor, it expands it, showing that the concern with desire and excess is universal, and the aspiration for self-transcendence, that is, to move beyond our self-centered cycles and limitations, is a recurring dream of humankind. Let us consider for a moment what it means that Kazantzakis understood in that honey-drenched moment. In terms of the philosophy of mind, this could indicate a shift in his consciousness, or at least in his perspective. There is a concept in psychology and mindfulness practice of becoming aware of awareness. Basically, recognizing one's own thoughts and desires as objects of observation rather than simply being swept up in them. Perhaps the sight of the bee gave Kazantzakis such a moment of meta-awareness. Instead of merely thinking, "Oh, how sad a bee died," he might have felt a jolt of recognition about how his own mind worked, how desire had a grip on him that he hadn't fully seen before. To say "I understood" is to imply that something clicked internally, possibly a reconfiguration of values or a newfound clarity. If prior to this he, like most of us, instinctively chased certain honeys in life, maybe now he saw those pursuits in a new, more critical light. It could be that this understanding sparked even a small instance of self-transcendence, meaning he momentarily stepped beyond his former self, seeing through the spell that certain pleasures cast. In philosophical terms, we might say he experienced a moment of insight where the subject-object relationship shifted. He was no longer just a subject craving objects like the bee craved honey, but an observer noticing that craving from a higher vantage. Such shifts in consciousness, even if brief, can lead to lasting ethical and practical changes in how one lives. That brings us directly to the ethical dimension. What do we do with this understanding in the context of our everyday choices, especially regarding consumption, work, and technology? The bee's lesson invites us to examine what honey means for us and how we engage with it. Consider consumer culture and the ethics of consumption. Modern society often encourages us to indulge, accumulate, and consume ever more food, more stuff, more entertainment. It's as if countless advertisers are whispering to the inner bee in each of us, "Dive in, there's never too much honey." Yet we also see the fallout of overconsumption, obesity and health issues from too much rich food, anxiety and emptiness from chasing material goods, environmental degradation from resource overuse. An ethical insight here is the importance of moderation and intentionality. It recalls Aristotle's idea of the golden mean, finding the virtuous balance between excess and deficiency. The right amount of honey nourishes, too much sickens. Ethically, we might ask, at what point does enjoying something cross into damaging ourselves or others? The answer requires honest self-reflection and often some restraint, which can be cultivated as a virtue. Now think about productivity in the modern ethos of work. Many people today drown in the honey of ceaseless productivity and achievement. There's a cultural admiration for working long hours, hustling relentlessly, chasing success as if it were the ultimate sweetness. Hard work and ambition are positive in measure, but beyond a certain point, they can lead to burnout, broken relationships, and a loss of one's deeper purpose. Essentially, the soul drowning in work. Here, understanding the bee's lesson would mean recognizing the signs of when a healthy drive turns into an unhealthy compulsion. It might mean setting boundaries on work hours, valuing rest and play, and remembering that more is not always better. Ethically, one might argue we have a responsibility to ourselves and even to society not to drive ourselves to collapse. A burned out person is not only suffering personally, but is also less able to contribute meaningfully to others. So the principle of moderation applies as much to striving in career as it does to consuming honey literally. And what about technology, which in our age provides perhaps the most tempting honeypot of all? Our devices and apps are engineered to capture our attention using flashes of pleasure, the ping of a new message, the dopamine rush of seeing likes on a post, the endless scroll of curated content. It is easier than ever to indulge a craving for stimulation or validation online and lose track of time, much like a bee getting drunk on an oversized supply of nectar. The ethical challenge here is tricky because these digital honeys are pervasive and sometimes necessary tools. Yet, we know they can lead us into addictive loops. To avoid drowning, we have to cultivate digital self-discipline, perhaps deciding intentionally when to engage and when to step away. That could mean simple practices like putting your phone out of reach during meals or turning off notifications during certain hours to reclaim your attention. On a broader scale, some ethicists suggest we need a collective effort to design technology in more humane ways that respect our cognitive limits. But at the individual level, the onus is still on each of us to be mindful. Understanding the bee and honey, we might start asking ourselves in various moments, am I still tasting the sweetness, or am I now just stuck in sinking? Is this video game or social media session actually making me happy, or am I just compulsively going through motions for diminishing returns? These kinds of questions keep the relationship with our honey honest. In all these domains, consuming goods, working, using technology, the aim is not to moralize by declaring any of them inherently bad. Honey is wonderful. Work can be fulfilling. Technology can be miraculous. The goal is to find what might be called the right relation to these things. A right relation is one where we appreciate and use them without losing ourselves to them. How do we measure that? One measure is autonomy. If you can at will step away from a pleasure or pursuit without severe distress, you likely still own your desire rather than it owning you. Another measure is harm. If indulging in something is beginning to harm your health, peace of mind, or relationships, that's a signal of excess. For example, moderate social media use can connect you with friends, whereas excessive use might start to erode your self-esteem or consume time you'd otherwise spend in more nourishing ways. With the bee story in mind, we become more alert to these tipping points. Ethically, we start to prize awareness and moderation as tools for living well. This doesn't mean a life of joyless self-denial, far from it. In fact, it can lead to greater joy in the long run because it keeps our pleasures sustainable and in balance with other goods. When you know how to taste honey without drowning in it, honey stays delightful. When you know how to work diligently without exhausting yourself, work remains rewarding. When you know how to use technology without being used by it, you can enjoy its benefits and then gladly return to offline life. In essence, the philosophical and ethical upshot of I understood is an invitation to conscious living. It's asking us to examine how we pursue what we pursue. It suggests that wisdom, that often old-fashioned word, lies in recognizing the limits and in orienting our lives toward a balance or even toward higher aspirations than mere consumption. Kazantzakis' beat gave him and now gives us a vivid checkpoint, a mental image that can flash in our minds at a decisive moment and ask, are you about to drown? And is it worth it? Our answer to that can redirect us toward a path where desire serves us in life-affirming ways rather than leading us to a dead end. The lessons of the drowning bee don't only appear in spiritual parables or philosophical discourse. They also manifest in empirical research and the study of complex systems. We'll touch on 3 science-related angles that shed light on why beings like bees or humans might overindulge to their detriment, the psychological distinction between wanting and liking, the concept of supernormal stimuli and how feedback loops can trap us, and finally, a look at system dynamics models of overshoot and collapse. First, the brain's handling of reward has an intriguing quirk. The processes of wanting and liking are not identical. Liking refers to the actual pleasure or satisfaction one gets from something. The sweet taste of honey on the tongue, the contented feeling after a good meal. Wanting, on the other hand, refers to the craving or motivation to obtain the thing. Neuroscientists have found that these 2 aspects of reward are mediated by different neural circuits. For instance, dopamine in the brain is heavily involved in the wanting incentive. It drives an animal or a person to pursue rewards, heightening eagerness and effort. But the actual enjoyment, liking, linked to other neurochemicals such as opioids in the brain's hedonic hotspots, might not increase in tandem. In practical terms, this means it's possible to want something more and more even while deriving less and less pleasure from it. Think of an addict whose craving for the drug intensifies even as the euphoric payoff from each dose diminishes. Or consider how you might reach for a second or third slice of cake even though the first slice already satisfied your taste. The bee in our story likely experienced a powerful instinctual wanting for the honey enough to override any satiety signals. If a tiny insect can be said to have a dopamine-like drive, it was probably firing at full throttle as the bee dove in. Meanwhile, the actual liking, the sensory pleasure, might have been fleeting or even turned to distress as the bee became submerged. This separation of wanting from liking helps explain a lot of self-destructive indulgence in humans. It's why someone can compulsively scroll through social media or play slot machines for hours, long past the point of enjoyment. The wanting mechanism has taken on a life of its own, nudging the person to keep going, while the actual joy, liking, is minimal or absent. In short, the brain's reward system can malfunction or be misled, prompting behavior that objectively isn't rewarding. The understanding that more isn't always better on a neurochemical level aligns nicely with Kazantzakis' insight. Sometimes we pursue more honey not because it's increasing our happiness, but because something in us is caught on a treadmill of chasing the next taste. The second scientific concept to consider is the supernormal stimulus and the related idea of positive feedback traps. A supernormal stimulus is an exaggerated version of something biologically attractive, which an organism may find even more appealing than the real thing it evolved to seek. Classic experiments in animal behavior showed, for example, that certain butterflies were more attracted to a brighter, bigger artificial mate decoy than to actual mates, or that birds could be enticed to sit on giant fake eggs painted in intense colors in preference to their own normal-sized eggs. The artificial stimuli hijack natural desires, stretching them beyond their healthy context. In the modern human world, we are surrounded by supernormal stimuli of our own making. Candy and processed foods pack levels of sugar, salt, and fat that wild fruits or meats never have, making our taste buds roar with delight and urging us to eat beyond what's good for us. X-rated films present endless novel sexual images far removed from the subtle reciprocity of real relationships, potentially leading to desensitization or distorted expectations. Digital entertainment, from fast-paced video games to infinite social media feeds, is engineered to keep our brains hooked with rapid rewards, far more stimulation than, say, a natural walk in the woods would ever provide. Each of these is like an oversized dollop of honey that our inner bee was not evolutionarily prepared to handle in such concentration. We often find them hard to resist precisely because they exaggerate cues our brains have always found attractive. This leads to feedback loops. For instance, the more engaging your social media feed, the more you use it. And the more you use it, the more the algorithms tailor it to your preferences, making it even more engaging, and so on. Or consider comfort food. Feeling a bit down leads you to eat something sweet, which briefly boosts mood but then causes a crash, which leads to craving more sweetness to feel good again. A loop is born. Many of us have experienced these cycles where initial enjoyment can turn into a habit that's hard to break. The bee's predicament can be seen as a simple feedback trap. The taste of honey triggers the desire for more honey. That was good. Let me get even more, which triggers even more until the situation is out of control. On a larger scale, one might think of how a society that discovers a plentiful new resource, like oil or gold, could go into overdrive, exploiting it, everyone chasing wealth, positive feedback, until the fundamentals give way and the bubble bursts or the resource runs low, causing a crash. In psychological terms, understanding supernormal stimuli helps us be a bit more forgiving with ourselves, even as it warns us. It's not that we're simply weak-willed or bad if we get hooked on these things. In part, our biology is up against novel, turbocharged temptations, but knowing that we can try to design our environments and habits to reintroduce balance, essentially to protect ourselves from drowning in stimuli that are too potent. The third angle is to zoom out and look at whole system dynamics, specifically the pattern of overshoot and collapse. This pattern is well known in ecology, economics, and even historical analyses of civilizations. It goes like this: a system, it could be a population of organisms, or the growth of an industry, or consumption of a resource, starts with plentiful inputs and maybe some feedback that encourages growth. The more it grows, the more capacity it has to grow further, a positive feedback loop, leading to an exponential rise. However, at some point it hits a limit. Perhaps the food supply runs low, or the market becomes saturated, or the environment is damaged. After overshooting that sustainable limit, the system can't maintain itself and a rapid decline or collapse ensues. Picture a herd of deer multiplying in a lush valley with no predators. For a while, it's a golden age for the deer. Lots of food, more fawns each year. But if the population grows too large, they might eat up all the vegetation beyond its ability to regrow and then suddenly face mass starvation. In the human realm, think of economic bubbles, the housing market boom that leads to a crash, or the dot-com boom and bust. Prices and speculation feed on themselves, everybody diving in to get a piece of the sweet profit, until the fundamentals give way and the bubble bursts, causing a sharp retraction. How does the bee drowning illustrate overshoot/collapse? In a very compact form, the bee's consumption overshot what its little body could handle. The collapse was swift and terminal for the bee. It's a reminder that there are limits, often non-obvious until we hit them. Systems thinking would prompt us to ask, where are the limits in our own cycles of desire? And are we pushing past them unknowingly? For example, as a society, are we consuming natural resources or fossil fuels in a way that overshoots what the planet can bear, risking a collapse of ecosystems or climate stability? On an individual level, one might consider how a personal pursuit can overshoot. A person might devote themselves entirely to career success, positive feedback from promotions and praise fueling more work, until they hit a health breakdown or a burnout collapse. The overshoot collapse model, therefore, is like a structural insight behind the bee metaphor. It's crucial to state some uncertainties and limits of these scientific perspectives. Human behavior and societies are complex, and not every cycle is destined to end in disaster. We have capacities for foresight, self-regulation, and course correction that a simple model might not account for. For instance, even though the brain has separate wanting and liking pathways, we also have the ability to reflect on our experience and say, you know, I'm not actually enjoying this that much. I can stop. Not everyone gets caught in the same feedback loops. Personal differences in genes, upbringing, culture means some people have a much easier time moderating than others. Likewise, with supernormal stimuli, awareness can allow individuals to set personal limits or seek out more natural rewards. And in large systems, sometimes intelligent management and innovation can avert collapse. For example, a community noticing deer overpopulation might intervene with wildlife management to prevent starvation, or governments and industries might innovate new technologies and policies as resources run low, steering away from the worst outcomes. So while the models and analogies are powerful, they show us real tendencies and risks. They are not fate. They are cautionary tales told in the language of science. What they offer to our understanding of the bee and honey is a validation. It's not just a random bee accident. It exemplifies patterns that scale up from neurons firing in our brains to populations growing on the earth. This interdisciplinary view reinforces the central message by showing it operating at many levels of reality. It tells us that the struggle with desire and excess is wired deep within us and also plays out around us, and that recognizing these patterns is part of what it means to truly understand, as Kazantzakis did, the need for balance. No inquiry would be complete without testing its ideas against serious objections. Let's consider three major counter-arguments to the interpretations and implications we've been discussing and do our best to steelman them. That is, present them in their strongest form before offering a response. Isn't this just moralizing pleasure? One might argue that framing desire as a trap runs the risk of promoting an austere, even puritanical outlook on life. After all, desire is also what propels us to seek love, to create art, to strive for improvement. Without strong wants and passions, wouldn't life be dull and stagnant? The objection here is that by heeding the bee's warning too strictly, we might end up fearing sweetness altogether, living so cautiously that we never experience ecstasy or push the boundaries of what's possible. Many great innovations and memorable human experiences come from a place of intense desire or even excess. Think of celebrations where we intentionally let loose, or the periods of obsessive focus by an artist or entrepreneur that lead to breakthroughs. A critic could say, yes, a bee drowned, but bees also make honey by immersing themselves in nectar. Do we really want to tell the bee not to love honey? Perhaps the occasional drowning is the price of a life lived fully. Too much restraint can be as lifeless as too much indulgence. This is a vital point because there is indeed a balance to be struck. The intention behind analyzing the bee's fate is not to vilify pleasure or crusade for some joyless regime of self-denial. Passion, appetite, and even moments of abandon do have their place in a rich life. The key is context and awareness. When desire is in the driver's seat without wisdom, it can steer us off a cliff. That's the scenario we're warning against. But when desire is guided by insight and integrated with our higher aims, it becomes a creative force rather than a destructive one. A life of zero desire would be a flat life, and no one is advocating that. In fact, many of the traditions we cited, from Aristotle's golden mean to the middle way, are about a dynamic balance, not an extreme of renunciation. So acknowledging the objection, we incorporate it. The goal is not to extinguish all sweetness, but to taste it intelligently. One might say the bee's error wasn't that it loved honey, but that it lost its sense of measure and self-possession in that love. The opposite of drowning in honey is not drying up in a desert. It's swimming in the honey without suffocating, enjoying pleasures deeply but not exclusively, not addictively. If anything, understanding the limits allows one to savor the honey of life more, because you're not ruining your palate or your health by binging to the point of illness. In sum, a nuanced approach inspired by the metaphor wouldn't kill desire. It would cultivate desire in its healthy, inspiring forms, like the drive to create, to connect, to celebrate, while curbing the tendencies that make desire turn on itself. That makes for a life that can indeed be passionate and adventurous, yet also sustainable and free. You're over-interpreting a simple quote. A skeptic could say, maybe a bee in honey is just a bee in honey, and I understood could be as straightforward as I realized even good things can be fatal in excess. Perhaps we've spun an elaborate web of symbolism, cross-cultural philosophy, and neuroscience far beyond what Kazantzakis intended. The quote might not be meant to carry the weight of all desire in the universe, but merely to convey one insight in a particular moment. One might add that not every indulgence ends in disaster. Everyday life is full of people having dessert, drinking wine, or binge watching a show without dire consequences. So the bee's tale is a cautionary extreme, not a universal law. The critique here is essentially that we should not make a single anecdote do the work of a grand theory. It's absolutely true that a single metaphor can't capture the full complexity of human life, and we must be careful not to treat it as a one-size-fits-all dictum. We have taken Kazantzakis' line as a lens, one lens among many, to examine some big themes. In doing so, we went beyond the explicit content of the text, but we did so knowingly and, I hope, transparently. At each step, we tried to distinguish what was directly stated, textual evidence as we called it, from what was interpretive extrapolation. The value of a powerful metaphor is precisely that it can resonate with many ideas and experiences, even beyond the author's original scope. By engaging with those resonances, we're not claiming that Kazantzakis secretly meant all this or that the bee is the only metaphor one needs in life. Rather, we're exploring how this image connects to patterns that thinkers in many times and places have noticed. It's a way to organize our inquiry, and indeed, not every desire leads to drowning. Context and degree matter. If someone said, "Look, I eat chocolate cake on my birthday and I'm fine," there's no argument there. The bee's lesson applies when we cross that fuzzy line where delight turns into distress. We each have to discern where that line is for different activities. This lecture, using the bee story, provides some tools and perspectives to help find those lines. It's not a strict formula. In short, we embrace the nuance. The quote gives us a starting point, not the final word. Our deep dive is justified not because the quote explicitly contains all these layers, but because it opens the door to them. That said, the skeptic keeps us honest. We should always recall that metaphors are models of reality, not reality itself. They illuminate certain truths brilliantly while casting shadows over others. We accept that and proceed with a humble understanding that the bee drowned in honey is one piece of a very large puzzle. Maybe the quote is about tragic irony, not self-improvement. In this view, what Kazantzakis understood might be something darker and less instructive, perhaps that the universe is indifferent or that fate has a cruel sense of humor. The bee did what it was naturally programmed to do, seek honey, and it met an absurd end. Likewise, humans often follow natural desires or even noble aspirations and still meet suffering or failure. So one could interpret the line as a commentary on the tragic irony of life. Sometimes what you love or excel at is exactly what ruins you, and there may be no deeper meaning or moral to extract beyond acknowledging that irony. From this angle, our attempt to turn the bee's demise into a lesson about balance might seem like an optimistic spin. Maybe Kazantzakis' understanding was more of a grim epiphany, a recognition that no matter what, every sweetness has a drop of poison and that tragedy is inevitable. This interpretation has a certain existential bite to it, and given Kazantzakis' familiarity with tragedy, he was deeply influenced by Greek tragic drama and Nietzsche's philosophy, for instance. It's not an unreasonable reading. It reminds us that even if we do everything right, life can still surprise us in painful ways, a humbling truth. However, knowing Kazantzakis' broader outlook, there's also a defiant, life-affirming streak in his work. He often emphasized struggle and overcoming. His heroes are those who face the absurd or the tragic and still carve out meaning or joy. So even if the bee's fate is fundamentally tragic, the act of understanding it is inherently positive. It means one has gained insight that might help one navigate life's next steps. In other words, recognizing a tragic pattern can be the first step to transcending it, or at least not being blindsided by it. Our exploration of balance and self-transcendence doesn't deny that life has an ironic or tragic dimension. It simply asks, what is the wisest way to live in light of that dimension? If we accept that sometimes our desires betray us, then it's all the more reason to approach them with eyes open, perhaps even with a sense of humor and humility. Far from naive optimism, this approach acknowledges the worst. A bee can die in honey, and still says we can learn and adapt. Moreover, the fact that Kazantzakis chose to phrase it as "I understood" implies a takeaway, an insight of value. If his point was purely nihilistic, he might have said something like, "and there was nothing to be done" instead. The very act of understanding carries a subtle optimism, the belief that insight matters. And that is what we've run with in this lecture. The belief that by understanding this metaphor, we equip ourselves a little better for the sweet and sticky situations in our own lives. We could entertain more objections. For instance, someone might argue that sometimes only by nearly drowning do we learn our limits, as if the bee's sacrifice could be seen as a form of discovery. There's truth in the idea that experience teaches. Our responses are not meant to declare any one perspective null, but rather to show that the interpretation we've built around Kazantzakis' quote can stand up to critique by adjusting its emphasis rather than shattering. The cautionary perspective on desire doesn't have to make us joyless, nor does it claim to explain everything, nor does it ignore life's irony. It's a flexible insight. Handle the honey with care, but also with appreciation. In a way, the objections help refine that insight, reminding us to keep it balanced, which is fittingly exactly the point. Abstract understanding is valuable, but how do we apply these insights about desire and excess to our actual lives? Here are 3 short, reflective exercises to experiment with. Each is a way to gently explore your own honey situations and practice not drowning in them. The aim of these practices is not to test your willpower for the sake of it, but to increase your awareness and give you a taste, pun intended, of self-regulation and insight in everyday contexts. To examine the experience of craving, desire, as it arises without immediately acting on it, thereby learning how desire behaves in the mind and body. Choose a moment when you feel a manageable craving. It could be the urge for a snack, the impulse to check your phone, or any small desire that occurs in daily life. Instead of instantly satisfying it, pause. Deliberately give yourself 1 to 2 minutes just to feel the craving. During this pause, pay attention to what's happening. Notice your bodily sensations. Perhaps it's a slight tension in your stomach or your hand already twitching toward the smartphone. Notice your thoughts. Maybe a negotiation in your mind. I should have it, I've been good, or just 1 peek won't hurt. Or maybe an anxious impatience. I need it now. Try describing these sensations and thoughts silently to yourself, as if you were a scientist observing a creature, in this case your own self, feeling desire. If the craving isn't too strong, you might even extend the experiment a bit. For example, take the piece of chocolate, but don't eat it yet. Just hold it or smell it and observe how your body responds. Or if it's your phone notification, watch the screen light up and feel the impulse, but don't click for a moment. After this mindful delay and observation, you have a choice. You can either indulge the desire in a small conscious portion, eat a single square of the chocolate slowly, or check the one notification mindfully, or let the urge pass completely. Whichever you choose, do it with awareness. Ask yourself afterwards, how did the craving feel at its peak, and how long did that peak actually last? Did the intensity diminish after a while of not feeding it, or did it grow? If you indulge, did the reality match the mind's expectations? Was the chocolate as delicious as you imagined, or the phone update as satisfying? How did you feel, both in resisting for a time and in eventually acting or not acting? The goal here is to demystify the craving. You may discover, for instance, that an urge, when not immediately rewarded, doesn't infinitely escalate. It might rise, then plateau, or even drop. You might realize the anticipation was more exciting than the payoff, or that once you got over the initial hump, it wasn't as hard to resist as you thought. By performing this little internal study, you're training the ability to step outside of a desire and observe it, much like Kazantzakis stepping back and understanding something about the bee. It's a skill that can give you just enough space to make better choices when it really counts. And it also builds empathy for the bee. You feel in your own skin how compelling honey can be, and also how taking a pause can keep you from getting in over your head. To gauge and adjust your relationship with an activity that easily becomes an attention honeypot, especially something online, by consciously limiting it and reflecting on the experience. Many of us know the feeling of going online for just a minute and emerging an hour later, wondering where the time went. This experiment will help make that dynamic more visible. Pick a digital activity that tends to make you lose track of time. It could be scrolling through a social media feed, watching videos, or browsing websites. Before you start, set a specific boundary for yourself. For example, I'll scroll Instagram for 5 minutes, or I'll watch exactly one YouTube video then stop, or I'll play this game for 1 round only. You can use a timer if that helps, or plan to stop at a natural break, like after 1 episode of a show. Now begin the activity as usual, enjoy it, and indulge your curiosity as you scroll or watch. But when you reach the limit, the timer goes off or the episode ends, pay close attention to that moment. Notice, do you feel resistance to stopping, a tug that says, just a little more, I'm not satisfied yet? Does the app or website immediately tempt you with something else, another juicy video thumbnail, an autoplay of the next episode, or a notification that popped up? Observe both your internal state, maybe a hint of disappointment or the itch to continue, and the external triggers, the design of the platform urging you to stay. Now exercise your choice. Close the app or tab despite the pull. It might feel surprisingly hard. That's exactly what we want to notice. After you put the phone down or step away from the computer, reflect on what that experience was like. Was it difficult to enforce the limit you decided on? How did the craving to continue manifest? As a thought. There might be something important or really fun just beyond what I saw, or as a feeling, restlessness, FOMO, fear of missing out. Also consider how you feel having stopped at a reasonable point. Do you feel more in control, more calm, or are you still mentally hooked, thinking about what else you could have seen? If you found yourself unable to stick to the limit, say you watched 3 videos instead of 1, or played the game for an extra hour, reflect on that too without harsh judgment. What made it difficult to stop, and what did it feel like when you finally did stop? The aim of the honey test is not to make you swear off technology, but to illuminate just how sticky these modern honey jars can be. By creating an artificial stopping point, you shine a light on the usually hidden mechanics of compulsion. Over time, you might repeat this test and even experiment with strategies. For instance, disable the autoplay feature on videos so that it's easier to stop at one, or schedule social media use at certain times rather than letting it bleed into every spare moment. The outcome to look for is greater awareness of your digital appetite. When you know how strong it is and what triggers keep you hooked, you can better decide how to moderate it. The hope is that you gain the ability to enjoy your online honey without losing hours of your life to it unintentionally. To practice not forcing in a small aspect of your daily routine, allowing you to experience how easing up can sometimes lead to better outcomes or at least a calmer mind. This addresses excess not of consumption but of effort and control, another domain where we often overdo it and exhaust ourselves. Identify one task or situation in the near future where you will consciously try the principle of Wu-Wei, effortless action. It should be something low stakes to start with. For example, maybe you're going to clean your room or tackle a bit of work or a homework project. Normally you might approach it with a lot of self-pressure. I have to get this done perfectly, or I must finish this as quickly as possible. This time, set a gentle intention to do the task in a relaxed, non-striving manner. If it's cleaning, you might play some music and allow yourself to tidy things in a more leisurely flow rather than a rigid plan. You're still doing the work, but with a lighter touch, maybe even finding little moments of enjoyment in it. If it's writing or studying, give yourself a set period, say 30 minutes, to focus, and within that, let yourself take short breaks or stretch when needed rather than clamping down with iron will. Another context, social interaction. If you have a conversation or meeting coming up, resolve to listen more and not try to steer or control the outcome. Let the dialogue find its course naturally. During the experiment, pay attention to your stress and focus levels. Are you breathing more easily? Do you notice things, ideas, opportunities, solutions, or subtleties in what others say that you might have missed if you were very tense or aggressively focused? After the task or interaction, evaluate the results. Did things turn out worse, better, or just the same as when you approached with full throttle effort? Sometimes you'll find you were more efficient and creative by not overpressuring yourself. A pleasant surprise. Other times you might feel you got a bit less done, but also felt less drained, which is a valuable outcome in its own right. Importantly, reflect on your mood and mental state. Did you enjoy the process more by doing it in a spirit of ease? Did letting go of a bit of control make room for something unexpected? For instance, by not micromanaging a conversation, perhaps you learned something new from the other person or found the exchange more genuine. This exercise is about experiencing the difference between swimming with a current versus against it. It connects back to our broader theme by showing that not only with pleasures but with work and willpower, sometimes trying to drink up the entire ocean or micromanage every detail leads to diminishing returns, whereas trusting a natural pace can prevent burnout. You learn that you don't always have to grab and push. Occasionally, stepping back does not mean things fall apart. It might actually let them fall into place. Each of these exercises, observing a craving, testing your digital indulgence, and practicing non-forceful action, is a small personal way to play with the balance between desire and restraint, between action and relaxation. They are meant to be exploratory and even gentle, not punitive. Feel free to modify them to suit your situation. The ultimate measure of their value is what you discover about yourself. Ideally, you'll carry some of those discoveries forward. Maybe the next time you feel a strong urge, you'll remember, I recognize this feeling. I can pause. Or when you catch yourself doom scrolling, you'll be able to smile and set the phone down before it gets too sticky. These little practices build the muscle of mindfulness and self-regulation, which, as all our traditions and analyses suggest, is key to not drowning in life's many honeypots. To solidify all this, let's construct a simple mental diagram, a feedback loop that illustrates the dynamic of desire and excess. Visualize a circle drawn on paper. You can even do this later if you like. At the top of the circle, write the word sweetness. This represents the pleasure or reward, the honey, literally or figuratively, that life offers. Now draw an arrow clockwise to the right-hand side of the circle and label that point attraction. This is the craving or desire that the sweetness evokes. The presence or even the promise of something sweet leads to attraction. The sweeter things are, the more strongly we feel drawn to them. Next, from attraction, draw an arrow further down to the bottom of the circle. Label the bottom indulgence. This is the action of consuming or partaking, the bee diving in, or a person giving into the desire. Attraction leads to indulgence. We act on the craving to get the sweet reward. Now from indulgence, draw an arrow to the left side of the circle. There we write satisfaction with a question mark. I put a question mark because this is where outcomes can vary. Ideally, indulgence yields satisfaction. You got what you wanted and you feel content. But sometimes indulgence, especially excessive indulgence, doesn't satisfy for long or at all. It may lead to a fleeting pleasure followed by a craving for more, or even to discomfort and regret. Now complete the loop. Draw an arrow from that satisfaction. Point back up to sweetness at the top. But notice, if the indulgence was excessive, the nature of the sweetness might change when returning to the top of the loop. For example, the first cookie tastes wonderfully sweet, triggering attraction and indulgence. By the time you've eaten the 10th cookie, the sweetness might start to be cloying or even make you feel sick. In our diagram, we could imagine that with each cycle around the loop, the amount or intensity of sweetness at the top might increase, symbolizing that perhaps you seek an even sweeter or more intense experience next time to get the same level of satisfaction. This is how tolerance and addiction builds. You need more to feel the same pleasure. So we have a feedback loop. The sweetness leads to attraction. Attraction leads to indulgence. Indulgence results in some satisfaction or consequences. And then the cycle begins anew with perhaps an even stronger memory of sweetness or an unmet need for it, thus feeding back into attraction. If it's a positive feedback loop unchecked, it keeps amplifying. You can imagine drawing this not just as a circle, but as a spiral that goes inward, tighter and tighter. Each turn of the loop, the craving might grow, the indulgences might grow, until something breaks. In the diagram, I would draw a big bold slash or lightning bolt at some point on the loop that represents the collapse or breaking point. That is the bee drowning. It's the moment when the system can't cycle anymore in a healthy way. Perhaps in our circle at the sweetness stage, instead of a normal cycle back, we write too much honey with an explosion mark to show that the loop has essentially blown apart due to overload. At that point, the cycle is forced to stop. The bee is incapacitated. The person hits a wall, be it a health crisis, a moment of intense shame, or some external limit. Now consider another version of the loop, a balanced one. Draw the same circle: sweetness, attraction, indulgence, satisfaction. But this time, imagine a little break or limit that kicks in at the satisfaction stage. We could scribble a note there: pause or enough. This indicates a balancing feedback, some awareness or external control that tells the system to ease up. In this moderated loop, a taste of sweetness leads to attraction. You indulge a bit, you feel satisfied, and then you stop. The arrow from satisfaction going back to sweetness might now be a gentle one, not escalating. Next time around, because you didn't overload, the sweetness at the top still holds its pleasant value, and your attraction to it stays in proportion. In visual terms, this balanced loop might look like a stable cycle or an open spiral that doesn't collapse inward. It just goes on rhythmically. This is what a healthy relationship with desire looks like. An ongoing loop where each revolution doesn't drive you closer to a crash, but rather sustains you. You can carry this mental diagram with you. Whenever you sense you're caught in a loop, say repeatedly checking your email or having one more drink beyond enjoyment, imagine that circle with arrows and locate where you are on it. Are you still in the sweet, positive part of the cycle, or have you passed into diminishing returns? Is there a chance to apply a brake now at the satisfaction stage and not push into the danger zone? By picturing the process, you might find it easier to step out of it momentarily and adjust. It turns an abstract notion of moderation into something almost tangible, a lever or switch in the cycle that you can choose to pull. In essence, this loop diagram is just a visual aid to reinforce what we've been discussing all along. The bee's tragedy was a runaway loop of positive feedback with no self-correction until it was too late. Our goal is to introduce self-correction through understanding, through mindful practice, much earlier in our own loops of desire. When you can see the cycle, you're much less likely to be blindly driven by it. Instead, you can enjoy the ride for a while and then gently slow it down when you're reaching the limits, avoiding that disastrous overshoot. It's a mental picture of balance, a wheel that turns smoothly and continuously instead of a wheel that spins faster and faster until it flies apart. Keep that image in your toolkit. It might serve as a quick reminder in a tempting moment, capturing in a simple loop what Kazantzakis captured in one piercing line. We began with an image of a bee drowning in honey, a small concrete scene that frames a vast human problem. Through close analysis, we saw how Nikos Kazantzakis' enigmatic line encapsulates the tension between desire and destruction. Through symbolic and archetypal interpretation, we connected that bee to timeless human stories about hubris and the need for moderation. Through a cross-traditional dialogue, we heard echoes of the bee's lesson in the teachings of Buddha, Lao Tzu, Rumi, Stoic sages, and more different languages. Same fundamental insight. Beware letting your cravings run unchecked or seek something higher than the craving itself. We delved into the mind and found that understanding might involve a shift in awareness that empowers us ethically, whether in how we consume, how we work, or how we engage with technology. We also buttressed the idea with empirical knowledge. Our brains can trick us into wanting more than we truly enjoy. Our modern world is replete with hyper-palatable honeys, and unchecked systems can crash. Then we did not shy away from challenges. We considered objections and responded, making sure our interpretation remained balanced and life-affirming, not overly pessimistic or moralistic. Finally, we got practical, suggesting exercises to actually feel these dynamics in our own daily habits, and to practice the art of not drowning, be it in a cookie jar, an app, or a flurry of ambitions. So what does it all amount to? If we distill it, what understanding did Kazantzakis gain, and what understanding have we gained by extension? In one sense, it's the recognition that unbridled desire carries the seeds of its own negation. Too much pleasure can become pain. Pursuing any value single-mindedly to the exclusion of all else can undo that value. In another sense, it's the insight that we have the capacity to step back and change our relationship to our desires. This is where self-transcendence comes in, meaning the ability to go beyond one's current self, especially the compulsive, short-sighted self, and adopt a higher or wider perspective. The metaphor of the bee and honey illuminates a choice we continually face. We can be like that bee, following impulse into oblivion, or we can understand and thereby act differently. Understanding here is almost like waking up from a spell. The bee couldn't, but we can. In today's world, that wake-up call is urgently relevant. Our consumer society often encourages us to drown blissfully, to eat more, buy more, binge more, achieve more, as if more is always better. The message of the bee is not that honey is evil, but that without mindfulness, we might lose ourselves in pursuits that were meant to bring joy. If we internalize this lesson, how might it help with contemporary challenges? Take consumption. We might become more conscious consumers, happier with fewer but more meaningful possessions, finding that after a point, accumulating more stuff doesn't add to our happiness, but might even detract from it through stress, debt, clutter, or environmental impact. Take work culture. We might start valuing balance and well-being over the hollow prestige of being the busiest one in the room. The metaphor reminds us that the person who works 16 hours a day chasing success could be akin to a bee that found a lake of honey, impressive in the dedication, but at risk of burnout or a lost sense of purpose. A wiser approach might seek success in a more holistic sense, one that includes health, relationships, and contentment. Take media and technology. Perhaps we become a bit more skeptical of the endless feed of information and entertainment that bids for our attention. We might decide to be the ones controlling the off switch, ensuring that our engagement with media enriches us instead of depleting us. And in spiritual or personal development, the bee's lesson might help us avoid the trap of fanaticism or overzealousness. It's one possible to drown not just in material pleasures, but in ideologies, in routines, even in self-improvement quests. The motto, "nothing in excess," applies there too. Sometimes, in our eagerness to perfect ourselves or find absolute truth, we can become rigid or extreme, losing sight of compassion and common sense. It's also important to acknowledge limitations. This metaphor, powerful as it is, doesn't capture every nuance of desire. Not every sweet experience will lead to ruin. Life allows for many moments of harmless indulgence and even instructive mistakes. We shouldn't live in fear that every pleasure hides a fatal dose. The point is to be aware of the potential for excess and to respect the principle of balance. Another limitation, figuring out what moderation means, is a personal and often trial and error process. The right amount for one person in one context may be different for another. Our discussion and exercises provided tools and questions, but each individual must navigate their own boundaries. And we'd be remiss not to mention that sometimes life's honey is thrust upon us in ways we can't control. We might find ourselves overwhelmed, not due to personal indulgence, but due to circumstances. For instance, someone thrust into sudden fame or fortune might struggle with too much honey without having sought it. In such cases, the metaphor still offers empathy and a caution. Even good fortune needs grounding and wisdom to handle. In closing, Kazantzakis' haunting image stays with us because it is both cautionary and compassionate. "I understood," he wrote, suggesting that in that moment he didn't judge the bee, he identified with it. Perhaps he saw in that tiny creature's fate a mirror of human frailty and folly, and in admitting that, he already took a step towards wisdom. We too can use this mirror. We can remember the drowning bee in moments when life offers us an excess of a good thing. Rather than simply plunging forward, we can pause and understand. Understand that more is not always better. Understand that our freedom lies in the ability to say when and step back, and understand that by doing so, we actually preserve the sweetness of life. In a world filled with honeypots, from the literal sugary treats around us to the figurative lures of wealth, status, and endless digital engagement, such understanding is a quiet superpower. It lets us savor life's honey without drowning in it. Thus, the intertwined themes of desire, excess, and self-transcendence converge in this lecture's central insight. Desire gives life flavor and momentum, excess turns it into a trap, but self-transcendence, rising above the immediate urges, using wisdom and self-awareness, allows us to navigate between those two. We can enjoy the honey of existence while keeping our heads above it. Nikos Kazantzakis offered us a potent metaphor in that single line. It's not a stern commandment, but an invitation to reflect and to see our own behavior with clarity. By accepting that invitation, we equip ourselves a little better to meet the challenges of modern life, in consumption, in work, in media, in our search for meaning, with a balance of rigor and openness. We've explored the honey, we've observed the bee, and most importantly, we've sought to understand. In that understanding lies the possibility that we need not be drowned by our delights, but can instead be nourished by them wisely and well as we continue the ongoing human endeavor of finding the right way to live.